Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Now, our guest today is not a physician or a pharmacist or a dietitian. He is a citizen scientist whose contribution to lipidology has made a huge impact or a huge difference in our understanding of cholesterol. Dave Feldman, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dave, you're very welcome. I'm so pleased, very excited about this conversation today. Dave, you are, well, I introduced you as a citizen scientist, and we'll define that in a minute for anyone in the audience who's hearing it for the first time. But you also have a background in software engineering. I mean, that was your background. You're an engineer. So what is citizen? How would you define citizen science?
Well, I basically would just call it anybody who's not formally trained in science, but yet has a pronounced interest in, especially the more that they would like to contribute to the field. And maybe they can do that. There used to be a term called gentleman scientists, which of course is a bit gender normative. Now they would call them independent scientists, but it used to be a good example being like, say, Benjamin Franklin. It used to be that there were some folks who'd be like, I just kind of want to take on, doing a little bit of science, and then I'll just put in a book and then send out the book and see if that adds to the, to the literature. And that's how it was done.
Well, your contribution cannot be measured, but it sheds light on how we interpret data when it comes to lipid related data. But it also raises many, many more questions. We're going to talk in detail about Dave's research. But so what led you into researching cholesterol in particular? Because you had a good job. You had a very successful career as an engineer, as a software engineer. So why that shift?
Well, short version is I went keto, my cholesterol shot through the roof. I was originally trying to avoid type 2 diabetes, which is pretty prominent on my dad's side of the family. And at that time, I was just checking out diabetic forums, and they were talking about this low carb, new wave. And so I started doing it, and my dad and my sister started doing it around the same time. But their cholesterol didn't go up, mine did. And that got me extra curious because A, I was obviously afraid. I didn't know hardly anything about cholesterol when I started. And B, I was super curious. Why is it that my cholesterol went up, but theirs did not? And that got me obsessed. And I started learning everything I could about lipidology.
And then you found out, I think probably through social media, that other people who'd started keto also share similar experiences with you, right? And that's how you then founded the nonprofit organization, Cholesterol Code. Am I right in that?
Yeah. We're to be fair, we're kind of skipping through a few years of me doing a lot of self-experimentations. I was kind of a little bit more known for that because basically, as an engineer, kind of treating myself as patient zero, I just started doing high frequency testing. I started doing experiments against different food plans and just kept putting it out there. And you're right, social media became a means by which other people would reach out to me as I was putting the data out, just like a gentleman scientist, right? Well, gentlemen and lady scientists alike, also doing their own N of ones, kept sharing data back and forth. And more Cholesterol Code, which is it started as a blog. Now it's kind of our central repo. That really became sort of a central place where a lot of people going keto, seeing their cholesterol levels change a lot, they would go to. And then, yes, as you mentioned, it was a few years later that I eventually founded the Citizen Science Foundation. And it was primarily for us to set up this study around a particular profile that I call lean mass hyper responders. And lean mass hyperresponders aren't just known for having high LDL, which, and I made sure to get up here because I know I'm used to saying the Yankee units, as it were, but I want to speak with millimoles here. We have an LDL of 5.17 millimoles or higher. And alongside that, HDL of 2.07 millimoles or higher and triglycerides of 0.79 millimoles or less. Now, it's worth emphasizing that the reason that it's those three together is part of what this whole journey for me was. A lot of what you'll hear me talk about, and I know this gets a bit complicated for people, but a lot of what you hear me talk about is that I'm much more interested in looking at combination lipid data and the patterns around it, because I think that's far more relevant than to look at any of these all by themselves.
Yes. But lean mass hyperresponders, you created that sort of that phenotype, right? I mean, because the higher cholesterol seemed more prevalent in people who were lean.
Yes, absolutely.
In my case, my cholesterol went up, for example. But again, I'm a lean person. I in fact do weightlifting, etc. So I'm lean, I'm fit, yet my cholesterol went up. So is that your area of research, or are you looking at sort of cholesterol interpretation across this wider, sort of broader range of people?
A little from column A and a little from column B. So for sure, what you just described, it's true. I created the term, although at the time I didn't realize just how prevalent it was. The cut points I just mentioned, I thought that they were super rare, but not so rare that I couldn't just put it out there, because I was like, I seem to keep seeing this. People who are especially lean, who tend to be a little bit more fit, who tend to be very low carb, like, keto typically, right? It's just pattern recognition. It's not that I just like created the cut points out of thin air. It's something I observed over and over again. As you know, we already have something like that on the other side called metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is 5 different criteria.
Yes.
And that, by the way, includes triglycerides and HDL, which I just mentioned, but they're in reverse. Low HDL and high triglycerides. And then it has 3 other criteria, which is waist to hip ratio, blood pressure, and fasting glucose. Well, that too, that was also pattern recognition. That wasn't just, created out of thin air. It's because it was observed. I think it was originally called Syndrome X. And so in effect, this is basically the same thing. It's just that eventually I put a name to it. And then after putting a name to it, it helped, because then all of a sudden people could sort of mutually recognize these patterns, not only between each other, but also in clinicians and especially a lot of doctors treating low carb patients. They'd be like, oh, this is that pattern. This is, this triad you're talking about of very high LDL, very high HDL, and very low triglycerides. And yes, as you just mentioned, the highest LDL that we see in the low carb community tends to be these lean mass hyperresponders, which is kind of unintuitive, because you don't usually think of the people who have high cholesterol as those people who tend to be the leanest and fittest. Conventionally, on mixed diets, those who have higher cholesterol are those people we just talked about, the ones with metabolic syndrome. That tends to be a bit more common.
Well, high carb eaters, processed food eaters traditionally always had higher cholesterol levels, right? So you expect to see keto people who have optimal health markers otherwise, but with high presenting with high cholesterol levels. So I mean, it's interesting when you mention patterns, because as an engineer, you must be so used to looking at patterns anyway, data and patterns, and maybe sort of you're familiar with presenting data in graphs, etc. So that would have helped you. Let's talk about your hypothesis. What exactly did you want to look at? Because you ended up involving people, getting people to send you their data, so you could create a clearer pattern and then see if there is any interpretation or any way to explain what's happening. But what was your original hypothesis? And well, you did call it hypothesis. So that's why I'm using the word hypothesis, because that's what it was, right?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, this is also now published. We just published this year. It's called the Lipid Energy Model. Mm-hmm. And what we're positing, and this goes, back to 5-6 years ago, as I was like watching these patterns and as I learned about lipidology, is something that was already dear to me before I was even getting into this space, which is it's a network. And I know networks can get complicated, but in effect, you can think of a lot of things as networks, including, how we get groceries, for example. There's a network that brings those groceries to, come to the store and be stocked in just the right amounts, because basically it's just a combination of things working together. That's a network, right? Mm. Well, that's what I would posit is what we're seeing inside the human body. The same system that moves cholesterol around such that we can detect it, cholesterol in our blood, that same system is moving around all of the lipids that our body makes use of. So in a roundabout way, I like to say this for lay people, it's ride sharing, cholesterol ride shares in the same vehicle as the fat you're powered by. So if you're powered by fat, and you and I are, we're on a ketogenic diet, then there's going to be a bit more of the traffic of those vehicles that also carry around cholesterol. And that's kind of an important thing to bear in mind, because if cholesterol were all on its own, which is kind of how a lot of people think of it, including how I thought of it, before I'd gotten into lipidology, then I would be wondering the same thing. Is it just because I'm consuming more, like diet wise? Is it saturated fat gets converted into, like, all these ideas that I did not know until I was learning about that? No, actually, it's because not only do we have cholesterol that we might absorb from the gut, that's actually a minority of the amount of cholesterol that's in our body at any given time. Our liver actually makes several fold more cholesterol than we actually get through the diet. Yes. It's because it actively traffics it around. And the more you're powered by fat, per this model, the more it makes sense, potentially, that it would be trafficking more.
So when we're saying cholesterol, obviously you've noticed that in lean mass hyperresponders, cholesterol seems to go up the lower their carbohydrate intake is. But when we're saying cholesterol in this context, what pattern do you notice? Do you notice their LDL going up, or do you notice, because that would impact on the total cholesterol number, right? Or do you notice the HDL and triglycerides going up? Or so what's the pattern there? What do you notice?
Yeah, so typically it's those three things I mentioned before. LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, typically goes up. HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, typically also goes up. And triglycerides, if you're already athletic, your triglycerides probably already are low. They're probably already under 1 millimoles, but they might even get lower depending on how athletic you are. Mm. But the whatever diet you're on, I would argue you could, it's not that I'm setting aside LDL entirely, but I would argue that you'd want to be very interested in what your HDL cholesterol levels are and what your triglyceride levels are. And the model helps explain why it's so important, because triglyceride levels, triglycerides are fat. In fact, they're part of the fat that we're consuming. If you have a steak right now, you're going to actually literally be consuming triglycerides that are in the steak. If there's fat in the steak, right, that fat, just like our fat, has triglycerides. And triglycerides are part of the fat that also get moved around in these vehicles that I'm talking about. They're kind of like boats, if you will, right? Well, bearing that in mind, it may seem to not quite make sense when I say you're powered by fat, that you would see less triglycerides, if that's part of what you're getting powered by in your bloodstream. But that's easy to comprehend if you already can think about that in terms of glucose. What do we see with athletes, high carb athletes? Do we see that they have glucose levels through the roof? No, we don't, right? Because they're using them. They're using their glucose levels. You want to see that you're using your fat levels, whether you're on a low carb diet or not. Triglycerides being down low is a good sign that your body is making good, efficient use of them, and that it can put it away well, because metabolic health is that balance between building up and breaking down. And basically, the way I just simplify metabolic health is it's how good your body is at putting energy away and getting back out again. And in the case of fat, again, whether you're on a high fat or low fat diet, you need to be good at doing that.
Dave, do you have any of the sort of the criteria or the measurement or the thresholds for each of those, like LDL and HDL and triglycerides? So someone can identify themselves as a lean mass hyperresponder.
Yeah.
But we were talking about it just before recording as well. So
yeah, so it's an LDL of 5.17 millimoles or higher, HDL of 2.07 millimoles or higher, and triglycerides of 0.79 millimoles or lower. And I should emphasize, these are just sort of, estimates. Many people are borderline of these numbers. But this, I call it a triad, right? It's these three in combination. This triad is pretty common for people who are both metabolically healthy and on a low carb diet. They tend to have these three in common. They tend to have higher LDL, higher HDL, and lower triglycerides. If you're leaner, and if you're more metabolic, like if you don't already have some underlying conditions or comorbidities, there's a pretty decent chance that you'll exhibit this triad, the combination of these three together, when very low carb, when very fat adapted. And that gets back to the model. If you're really predominantly powered by fat, we believe that that's what helps to explain the higher levels of cholesterol in the blood.
Mm-hmm. So we've yet to figure out whether that sort of the long-term health impact of that, right? I mean, we don't know, not yet.
No, and that's why we're doing this study. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, the Citizen Science Foundation is a bona fide public charity. We started kind of around this study. The study is going to be the first. I mean, it could be the last if it doesn't go well, of course, but we believe it's going to be the first. It was originally set up, this study was originally going to be for 5 years, but it ended up being that only need to be for 1 year. And this is basically the gist of the study. We're getting a bunch of these lean mass hyperresponders. We're flying them to California, where there's a center that we're working with, the research center. And there, they're going to be getting a CT angiogram, often shortened to CCTA. CTA is really great. It does a high resolution heart scan. You get contrast dye, you get calcification measured, but you also get non-calcified plaque measured. And while originally we were thinking we'd need a 5-year span between the first scan and the last scan, our principal investigator, who has a huge amount of research under his belt, said, no, you should be able to see it in 1 year, because the degree of high LDL for these lean mass hyperresponders, I mean, already at like 200 and higher, there should be a very detectable signal of increased non-calcified plaque if the same risk factors apply as would be expected. Because again, the lipid energy model, I'm sure you've seen this before, and I'm sure your listeners have as well. You see these graphs that show, the higher your LDL, the higher your exposure versus time, the more plaque you're going to have. And the most compelling case for this has been those folks who were born with a genetic disease that results in high LDL cholesterol, known as familial hypercholesterolemia, or what most people just shorten to FH. And FH, going back 50 years ago to Brown and Goldstein, they would be born with very high levels of LDL that were never seen outside of this genetic context until now, until lean mass hyperresponders. So these lean mass hyperresponders, they're going to be the true, I guess you could say, almost control group to the genetic disease that results in this.
Correct me if I'm wrong. This isn't my area of research, Dave, but there are also, I believe it's epidemiological studies that show that, in populations where LDL is high, longevity is also, high. So any thoughts on what's happening there? I mean, that raises more questions than answers, right?
It does. It's an interesting point of debate for those folks who are very much proactive in looking to lower LDL as much as possible. And I want to, be fair to what I'm sure they would argue, which is that they feel confident that it's reverse causality. In other words, that where you see this association of higher LDL with greater longevity, it's because it's a health status indicator, that there are diseases that result in lowering of LDL that also kill the person. Therefore, that association of lower LDL and mortality is really just an indication of diseases that are yet to be discovered. Some of them have been discovered. For example, some cancers can result in lower LDL. Now, at the same time, I also want to present the counter case, which is that, to be fair, that's a hypothesis still, because you can't just say, well, we know this is bad, and we know this because there are diseases as yet to be discovered that we're sure is what's resulting in the lower LDL. I would say, well, sure, that's possible, but we need to prove that, right? The other thing is you can't absolutely assume causal directionality. Even if you find an example of where a disease can result in lower LDL, it doesn't actually mean that the lowering of the LDL didn't itself have a detrimental impact, just because the disease is doing both. And that goes in both directions, right? This is the problem with directional causality. So as always, I'm an advocate for something that just doesn't get done in the space, but that should be, in my opinion, which is that we should just be looking at folks who already have healthy lipid metabolism, who don't have some disease. I just mentioned those with FH, they're born with a disease that impairs lipid metabolism.
Yeah.
And if you have metabolic syndrome, then you've acquired a disease that impairs lipid metabolism. So to me, scientifically, the correct move is to say, okay, we know that it's possible that an impairment to lipid metabolism is possible, that it creates both the higher LDL and this association with cardiovascular disease. Our best option is to look at those folks who have a functional lipid metabolism while also having very high LDL. To me, that just makes common sense, right? And that's why this study is one of a kind right now. I actually don't know of any study that's ever been performed on people who have normal lipid metabolisms, but with very high LDL on purpose. I don't think it's ever been done.
This is what I like about you. You're just so fair and not you try to avoid bias as much as possible. You have that fair outlook. Do we know if the FH group are relatively large?
They're not. In fact, so let me step that back for a second. The group I was talking about are those who have something known as homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. As you learn about genetics, and excuse me for a sec, because this is going to get a little tiny bit technical. So if you have one allele, then you're heterozygous. That means you have one thing that's normal and one thing that's, abnormal when we're speaking in this context, speaking in FH, right? Homozygous means both alleles are in this abnormal. And that's about a 1 in a million chance that you're going to get homozygous FH. So the reason this was such a compelling case is, go back 50 years ago, the seminal work of Brown and Goldstein, who won a Nobel Prize for this work, by the way. They were looking at very young patients. It's this heartbreaking story, but it's true. Very young patients who had who were presenting with something known as xanthomas. Xanthomas are like deposits of cholesterol that can come through the skin, especially in like tendons and so forth. And these young patients would get them at like age 3, 4, or 5. And this patient that they were looking at, she had xanthomas at age 3, and she had an angina, which is chest pain, at age 3. And unfortunately, she had her first heart attack at age 6. Now, her LDL cholesterol was around 780. So I think that would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 millimoles in your units, right? Mm. But this next part's kind of important to note. From that, they took that because she also had these super high levels of LDL, that this was one of the best cases of looking at it purely because there were not these other risk factors. So because she wasn't a smoker, she's not a type A personality, she doesn't have diabetes, then if you feel it's just the concentration of LDL that could cause this, it's understandable why they would come to the conclusion that it must be this genetic disease provided the opportunity to see this as causal. Now here's the thing that's kind of scary, but also kind of scientifically interesting, which is that I know people who are at that little girl's levels of LDL right now. They're very few, and they usually have some kind of medical reason to be super keto, to be super low carb, such as they're battling cancer or something like that, right? And they're using this as a treatment option. And they're not necessarily comfortable with their high LDL, but they have medical reasons of their own to do that. Well, as you might imagine, then we should see rapid development of atherosclerosis, the same plaque we were seeing in those children with homozygous FH. That comparison should be 1-to-1, right? If high LDL causally creates the atherosclerosis, that's what we should see with our study, our lean mass hyperresponder study. Yes, your eligibility is like, it's close to the lean mass hyperresponders at like around an LDL at 5.17. It's around there. But we have many that are at 10 that I know are in the groups and that may end up being in the study. We should see it. That's why we should see it in 1 year, by the way. We should see it in 1 year. That's why our principal investigator was as confident as he was. It makes sense. We should actually see that progression pretty quickly. So this data is going to be pretty powerful, whatever it shows us.
So when do you think we can see that data? It's not been a year yet, right?
No, and it's okay. I only smile because I get that question probably a dozen times daily at least. But yes, so when our recruitment wraps, when we're done recruiting, whenever that point in time is, that'll be the last patient of the study. It'll be 1 year from that period of time.
Right.
That will be completed because they'll be the last one to have gotten their second scan. And then we'll publish after that. And there's a chance we have some preliminary data to share before then, but I wouldn't count on that. So if I were to guess, it might be roughly 1.5 years from now, which I know sounds like a long time to a lot of people, but if you knew how the gears of this research works, that might as well be a lightning strike. It's so quick. And I'm sorry, as a software engineer, it's been a growing pain for me because I live in a world, my colleagues and I, if you're not growing, you're dying. And we churn out products left and right constantly. We can't wait to tear down the last hypothesis or the last protocol. We can't. That's creative destruction is our world. So it's almost the exact opposite from the one that I'm engaged in now as a citizen scientist. But you work with the tools you got. So.
Well, and the science is complex. So you're doing a great job. I have so much respect for what you're doing, Dave. Okay, so I have a particular interest in blood sugars, HbA1c, as a type 1 diabetic of 44 years now, but also my area of research is diabetes, but particularly type 1 diabetes and keto and fasting, intermittent fasting, extended fast as well, which I myself do. I didn't reveal that information to you earlier on when we were talking. So yes, I do extended fast as well. So I do wonder if that also had an impact on higher LDL. Have you been able to, I mean, it's not, my LDL isn't high in normal terms, but it's higher than it was a year ago. So have you been able to notice the impact of fasting on LDL? We'll talk about that.
Oh, well, I'm very acutely hooked into that. I mean, it's a huge part of our research. So let's go from one step to the next. If you're powered by fat, our models suggest that you already are having more turnover of your fat cells, known as adipocytes. And what I mean by turnover is you're just using them more. You're putting fat into them and you're taking fat back out of them. You have to, in the same way that if you are powered more by carbs, you're putting carbs away, as in glucose, into glycogen in your muscles and your liver. Well, you've swapped it. Now you're using your fat cells more, right? So what does that look like? Well, when you're eating, you're putting it in. When you're not eating, you're taking it out. That means the fat's coming out and into your bloodstream, which it should, because it needs to. I have a layperson version that I think you'll like. Your body is tasked with running a buffet line called your entire circulatory system, right? So if you think of your bloodstream as something your body has a hugely elaborate system to constantly keep energy in play for, so that all your cells, which are the customers, can quickly grab it, right? So if your glucose is going down, it's like, hey, let's get the fat, pull the fat out of storage. We need to get that in there, right? So make sure that the fat's in there. Okay. Well, if you're now fasting on top of that, well, now you're not bringing in fat from your gut, because you're not bringing anything in. So you have to use even more coming out of your fat cells. You were already turning over a lot, being fat adapted. Now you have to get even more out at a faster pace. That means more fatty acids. And we would posit that also means potentially a lot more cholesterol that's going to show up in an extended fast. So this is a common thing that happens. People go, oh my gosh, my last cholesterol test was so bad. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do an extended fast before the next one. And then their cholesterol's through the roof. Their cholesterol's through the roof because our model would posit that, well, what you did was you now brought more of those fatty acids out of your fat cells. And the kind of boat it's picking up with the cholesterol in it is predominantly a boat that's packaging fat from storage. The LDL, they're downstream of the bigger version of it called a VLDL, and that comes from your liver. That comes ultimately from your fat cells more than other fat sources. And that, by the way, is why a lot of people have done, including me, I've shown my LDL will drop like a rock if I actually consume a lot of fat, which was to prove a point. It was to say, hey, how can I consume a lot of fat and bring down my LDL? Well, because I'm bringing in fat from the outside. And therefore, I shut down the amount of fat that has to leave my fat cells. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. I'm just surprised that never once did I get asked if I was fasting before I went for my blood test. Never once.
Yeah.
Interesting, right?
And and if I can just fit this in, this is a big problem for people going low carb, because if you're on a low carb diet, and I know it's the guidelines now, where they'll say you don't need to fast to get your blood test. I'm just going to tell you right now, don't be surprised if your lipids look very wonky, because you're literally you're consuming foods rich in fat. I guarantee you're bringing triglycerides into your bloodstream. That's part of what you're powered by. So you might, for example, get a blood test with really high triglycerides. And you're like, I don't even understand why this is happening because I'm on a low carb diet and I thought triglycerides go down. Well, if you never had a period of time to fast, it's no different than if you just had, a 6-pack of Cokes or something like that right before you took your glucose. Which as a type 1 diabetic, you know why that would be problematic, right? So yes, I'm a big fan of fasted tests, just not extended fasted tests. I don't want to make recommendations medically, but I like about 12 to 14 hours roughly in an overnight fast. So whenever your dinner was, let's say it was at 7 p.m., 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and the next morning is when I would get a blood test.
Yeah. You've mentioned that. I did remember the 12 hours. You've mentioned that before. Okay, so I'm seeing the pattern now, and it's so much clearer to me than it was an hour ago. Did you notice any pattern, Dave, in people's A1C levels and what was happening to their cholesterol levels?
Yes, so this is actually a bit of a controversial topic, but I'm going to caveat that this is a hypothesis, but it's just the one that makes the most sense to me. Lean mass hyperresponders, again, we've established that per our model, they're powered much more by fat. If you're powered much more by fat, there's something called the Randall cycle, which I'm not going to get into. It's a bit complicated, but it has to do with the competing within your body between fat sources and glucose sources. Well, there are some things that can only be powered by glucose, not many, and it's mainly your red blood cells, right? Well, if your body is powered by fat, it makes sense that it would say, well, for cells that can be powered by fat, we want you to preferentially take fat and leave the glucose, leave it in the bloodstream, right? Well, because of that, I think it's why we see some lean mass hyperresponders in particular who will have higher than expected fasting glucose. I'm not talking through the roof. I'm talking, I think for units, I think it would be around 5 millimoles, but it's like close to where they might think you might even have diabetes or prediabetes, and an A1C that might be higher than expected, not diabetic high necessarily like 6.5, but like 5.5 to 5.9 is not surprising to me. The reason being that if your glucose is being spared into your bloodstream for a longer period of time, that has a lot of relevance because it means that, because that's actually how they test A1C, as you know, it's yes. A hemoglobin, right? Okay, but is this diabetes? I would argue this isn't anything like diabetes at all. If you put a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, on somebody who's exhibiting the pattern I'm describing, it's typically a flat line, right? Like it's almost exactly flat. Well, as you come to learn about diabetes, it's a disease of dysregulation. It's not a disease of regulation, of overregulation. When we go and we look at somebody who's on a keto diet and they have a fasting glucose of, let's say, 5 millimoles, but their fasting insulin is like 2, right? And again, we're talking the CGM is flat. What does that say to me as an engineer? To me, that says that it's with very little amounts of insulin, it has a very tight homeostasis. It's holding it inside this delta that's super tight. I have a tough time believing that that's disease causing, that's pathogenic. That makes a lot of sense to me from the Randall cycle point of view, right? So I know it's somewhat controversial because there still are a lot of people who treat A1C as the end all indicator. I don't. I treat fasting insulin and homeostasis, control of your blood glucose, especially talking to a type 1 diabetic, probably better than most, just how meaningful that is.
Perhaps as a type 1, I should be looking at my blood sugar fluctuations, a lot more than where my HbA1c is. Because I'll tell you what happened, and your explanation makes again, hypothesis, but it does make a great deal of sense to me. My A1C also went up. I kind of started extended fasting at the same time as I started introducing meat into my diet, because I was vegetarian or meat eater for 30 years. Then, so I started eating meat. 6 months later, my LDL went up, as well as my A1C.
For example, here in the US, we have the CDC, which has NHANES. NHANES is a data set that starting in, I want to say 2005, they started taking insulin levels, fasting insulin. So you could actually draw on that. But the fasting glucose they had going back to 1999. Well, okay. So let's say that we started looking at data going from 2005 and up, and we found that fasting insulin had a much more pronounced association to causal, associated outcomes with diabetic complications, right? This wouldn't surprise you or me at all, right? Because it's again, I liken it to saying, look, before we knew how engines work, we knew that cars that were generally louder had more problems. And then as we learned more about how engines work, oh, actually, no, some cars are louder because they've just got more cylinders, or they've got more horsepower or something like that. But then you've got a whole bunch of people that, well, we have all these studies on cars that are loud. You can't deny that association is there. We should have it be both quieter and have it be a good engine. It's like, I don't follow you down that road, right? In the same way that BMI, body mass index, is commonly used because it's pretty reliable given how often a high BMI is a result of being over fat relative to how often it's associated with being low fat but muscular, because that second group is less common. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, if you go to a new country where all of a sudden bodybuilding is coming up, it's becoming a bigger deal, and now you see that even more strikingly. That's exactly when you should get more interested in the specificity of that data. That's why it's I was doing the same thing when I'd first learned about glucose levels and A1C. Is I had a tough time getting back away from it mentally until I could start seeing the mechanism playing out in front of my eyes. And then at that point, as I understood a little bit more about how insulin works, and especially once I got CGMs involved, that's when I started just like losing interest in fasting glucose and A1C as single incidental markers, period. Because let me just fit in one more thing, because I know I get a little bit on a soapbox about this one. Without question, a dysregulation in insulin, such as type 2 diabetes, when poorly managed, is progressive. It will continue to get worse, right? Most of the time. Is this what you're going to see, for example, with your A1C, once weight's stable for a period of time and once everything else is connected? I don't know. I don't know that I'm going to expect that in a few years' time, we're going to talk and you'll be like, oh yeah, now my A1C is at 7.8. It just keeps going up and up and up. I don't think that's what we're going to see. Just my 2 cents. But again, it's a hypothesis.
Interesting. Right. So Dave, there's so much I've learned from our conversation. How can people support your foundation?
Well, of course, it is a bona fide public charity. You can straight up contribute. Go to citizensciencefoundation.org. It's worth noting that because I'm a software engineer, I've sought to pay all my own bills via my work with engineering. So the Citizen Science Foundation has 0% admin overhead. The only money that goes out is for like third-party services, which are relatively low for like credit card processing or website hosting. But we actually do not have staff, pay anybody. Contributions go pretty much entirely to the study. And in some point in time, we may actually have more studies. And yes, we do still have more money to raise that we need to raise because unfortunately travel costs have gone through the freaking roof. So thank you for the opportunity to plug that, because that has been kind of a challenge for us. But yes, that's the best place to go.
I'm going to put all the direct links in the description notes below so people can access the site and donate. One last question, Dave, before we wrap this up. We talked about HbA1c and blood sugars and why they may rise if someone is fasting and they are on the ketogenic diet, etc. Now, what roles do some of our hormones play in our cholesterol figures? For example, leptin and insulin, because I know you've mentioned both leptin and insulin in your presentation of the lipid energy model.
Yes, hugely important in our opinion. So of course, insulin being the very well-known anabolic hormone, the fact that it's dropping is very indicative, especially when lacking a response of glucose stimulus, possibly even GLP-1, which is why carnivore might matter as well. Leptin is, we get a little bit geeky here, but it's a kind of signaling molecule that comes from your fat cells. It's an adipokine. And the analogy I like to use for lay people is, imagine your liver is like the conductor and your fat cells are like the symphony, right? And your conductor is constantly listening to the symphony. So those adipokines, those signals, are really the way by which your fat cells are kind of telling their status back to the liver. Well, leptin gets higher and higher the fuller they are. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but not too far off. And that's why oftentimes people think of leptin as the fullness hormone. It turns out it's a bit more complicated than that, but there's no getting around this aspect. When leptin's getting low, your liver, the conductor, goes, oh, we need to bring up more of the sound, if you will. And in this case, by sound, I'm talking, we need to bring up more of the release of these free fatty acids, because we have to keep repleting. We have to keep repleting those fat cells. They have an important job. And a lot of this are things we've learned just in the last 10, 15 years, literally in medicine, is just how active an endocrine organ the fat tissue is on our bodies. It's hugely, hugely relevant. And there's all sorts of diseases when that communication between the conductor and the symphony are getting broken down, right? And frankly, I think this is where we're going to find a lot of these metabolic diseases, that communication breakdown. So getting back to the hormones, that's a lot of what hormones are. They're a loud signal. They tend to be very broad. And leptin is a major signal that the fat cells have back. Well, when it gets low enough, and that means there needs to be more activation of the fat coming back out and then recirculated back again, that gets back into our model. It means more traffic, means more vehicles. More vehicles means more ride sharing by cholesterol, right? And therefore, that's going to be highly relevant.
Could that also potentially mean more weight loss for people who are interested in weight loss? Oh.
Well, I mean, to be fair, you're probably losing weight the lower your leptin gets, but it's also a chicken and egg thing, right? So as you have less and less fat mass in your adipocytes, of course, there's going to be less and less leptin, right? And this is part of why we know it's not truly true that it's the fullness hormone, because if that were the case, then lean mass hyperresponders would be ravenously more hungry than everybody else, right? All the time. And I know plenty of lean mass hyperresponders who are doing like one meal a day and finding out that they actually need to up how much they're eating because they're eating too little. Not that you can't be on one meal a day, but I'm just saying it's one of the funny things is when you're very low carb, I'm sure you know this, a lot of people get to a point where they actually have to be mindful to eat more because they're so satiated.
Mhm.
And that happens a lot with lean mass hyperresponders. But that comes back to leptin not really being the fullness hormone, because these same lean mass hyperresponders we test, they'll tend to have very low leptin, which falls in line with the model.
How interesting. I didn't know that at all about leptin. Dave, we've got to do this again in a year's time, a year and a half. So all about your most recent research. Thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure meeting you and talking to you. I'm sure our audience will love this. I will put all the relevant links in the description. People check them out. And thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me.